We acknowledge the Ancient Ones, the Greater Shamanic Council of Light, Hermes, Thoth, Trismegistus, and Seshet, Lady of the Measuring Cord, as above, so below, as within, so without. We acknowledge Imhotep, Architect of the Cosmos. May the earth be the mirror of heaven. We acknowledge the sacred order of the Magi, and all throughout history who knew, like now, a turning of the ages. We acknowledge the master builders of Göbekli Tepe and the great shining ones at Kalash. The courage and knowledge of the Polynesian wayfinders traversing the great oceans. We acknowledge the prophetic traditions of Ezekiel and Daniel, the traditions of Avalon, the Merlin, and the Round Table, the calendric wizardry of the Maya, and the Venus teachings from Mesoamerica, the Jupiter teachings originating in China, and the Vedic lunar mansion traditions, the Babylonian and Sumerian sidereal zodiacs, the brilliant Hellenistic invention of the seasonal zodiac. The Neolithic peoples around the planet, some still today, honoring the sacred connection between the land and the sky. The Tuatha De Danann in Ireland, who created a time of 2,000 years of peace, the builders of Newgrange. My teachers that are not in human form, Mount Shasta, the Grandfather Rock at the Wonderland of Rocks in Joshua Tree, Mount Haleakala on Maui, the Fish Lake Valley, Hierophany, and the sacred landscapes around the planet, the astrosophy of Rudolf Steiner, and the esoteric astrology of DK in the Tibetan, both presaging the shamanic astrology paradigm, and particularly the archetypal visions of C.G. Jung and the cosmology of my mentor, Dane Rajar. For these and more, we give thanks. This is Daniel Gemario for the monthly, what I'm now liking to call the video blog rant, which we used to be doing during the full moon, but now we'll have a new schedule to have it happen on the new moon. And we have an interesting subject for today, and I want to actually introduce Awen, who's our managing director, who will be assisting me on today's rant. and so let's get into it. Maybe just put up the first slide, and then I can describe what it is I'm hoping to do over this next hour.
All right, here we go.
So the title of this is Aquarius and its Shadow Revisited. And amazingly, this is the 17th of these now. And these all go up on YouTube also when we're done with them. And later there'll be a transcript provided also. What inspired me to talk on this subject today is the weaving together of two things. One is the placements of the Venus, Mars, and Saturn in the morning sky now, that myself and Eric and some others have been, writing pretty extensively about. These last few days have been very stunning with this ever-changing triangle kind relationship between those three, and also the fact that they're in Aquarius. The two things I'm wanting to weave together. One is, how does this relate to the larger Venus-Mars saga, of which we have seminars on that, and we have written some stuff about that. But it has to do with this pattern of what happens when Venus and Mars will be together in the morning sky for a long period of time. And this is part of what we call the Dumuzi Rapunzel saga, which I'll get into in more depth here over these next few moments. And what would be the implication at this time of history for that portion of the saga, where in the old days it was called, and they lived happily ever after. In other words, it was the thing that was projected onto it
was that that's where the prince and Rapunzel get together and things are good. How would that relate to our time? And how would that relate to the fact that it's Saturn in this rather unique and not that often found relationship in the morning sky with Venus and Mars and Saturn? This was actually quite an interesting configuration in my own life, because in 1972, I was engaged in a long meditational training program. And every day I would look out the window and I would see Venus and Mars and Saturn forming ever more interesting triangles. And I've saw in one of the pieces of research that I saw that there won't be something quite like this with Saturn, Venus, and Mars until 2040. So this is a very unique pattern, and I want to see how that could relate to the overall dance of Venus and Mars in these larger stories. But the other theme would be, so when we talk about Aquarius, what are we actually talking about? And so this is something which some of you have heard me say in the past, that when we talk about Aquarius, there's actually quite a big distinction between Aquarius the sign and Aquarius the constellation. And I want to kind of unpack all of that, but then to also kind of put it all together as a speculation on what is Saturn's quote contribution to Venus and Mars here at this time, and also how this could potentially relate to the shadow of Aquarius. And as I have suggested over the past number of years, actually as far back as 2017, that the shadow of Aquarius is the top-down control, kind of a collectivist, technocratic, scientific elite wanting to control everyone in the name of harmony and understanding, right? So these are all the kinds of themes that I'm wanting to get into here. Well, let's go to the next slide so we can see exactly what's happening like right now. So this would, this is what would be pretty easily seen tomorrow morning for those of you in the United States or Canada area. We saw something almost exactly like this yesterday morning here, over here in Asia. And one of the things that inspired me to do this presentation today is the fact that you can see here that Saturn is pretty much right at the midpoint between Venus and Mars. And in this particular time period within the Venus and Mars dance, they're together for about 2 or 3 months. They'll still be together until many more days in April. And so the fact that that Saturn happens to be with Venus and Mars during this portion of the saga, I think is particularly important, as well as the fact that it happens to be emphasizing Aquarius. That's not the sign of the overtones or the overstories of Venus and Mars, but it happens to be where they are now in Aquarius, and clearly the Saturn placement is hugely important for many other reasons. The ongoing square with Uranus, it's rapidly approaching a conjunction with the United States moon position. So there's a lot of things here, and you'll notice when you look at this chart that we could very easily put our attention elsewhere. We could say, well, look at there's a moon, Jupiter, Neptune. We just did our seminar last week on Jupiter conjunct Neptune. I can certainly refer you to that if you haven't had a chance to see it. But we could very easily be redoing that seminar right now, because the moon is right with Jupiter and Neptune, like pointing that out to us. And then also the other thing we could be putting our attention on, and I believe there's some posts will be coming out about it, which is the rather unique Sun-Mercury Chiron. This is when Mercury is on the other side of the sun and with Chiron at the new moon. So that's another really fascinating and remarkably important thing that's happening in these times right now. Let's go to the to see what the charts of the exact conjunctions. All right. So here we have March 28th, it was a couple days ago. That was when Venus and Saturn were right there at the 21st degree of Aquarius with the Aquarius moon. 24 Aquarius, Venus, Saturn, and Mars. A very unique, and it was very beautiful. I had a chance over here in the morning to be able to see it pretty clearly, and to see that ever-changing triangular relationship, and then the moon was there. And then still a few days in front of us is the exact conjunction of Mars and Saturn, and it's actually the very next day that Venus will move out of Aquarius into Pisces. So that kind of ends the time frame that we're putting a lot of attention on now, which is this focus on Saturn's contribution, as it were, to Venus and Mars. Now, before, I think maybe the next thing that would be good for us to look at is, rather than this Venus and Mars saga and speculating on what could be happening currently with that, what story can we project onto that? I think it would be useful to have this discussion now about, so what Aquarius are we talking about? And let's go through, right, at this point, we're going to be looking at, to be very clear here, the sign of Aquarius, not the constellation. And I just need to interject here that when people talk about the age of Aquarius, it's not the sign, it's the constellation. And we'll see some stuff about the constellation in a few moments. The person who got me into astrology in the first place was Dane Rudhyar. I talk a lot about Dane Rudhyar. And this was from his book that first came out in the 30s until it became a paperback edition in the late 60s. And here's what he says about the sign of Aquarius: the power to express ideals and to create in terms of social behavior, the creativeness of relationship. Now that, of course, has to do with the kind of 11th house connotation, and the fact that Aquarius has to do, the 11th house in particular, has to do with groups, kind of the opposite of Leo, which is really about individuals. And whenever we think about any sign, it's really important to think of it as the axis. It's a resonant polarity with its opposite sign. And then he lists the concrete and traditional meanings: idealism, humanitarianism, self-expression through collective movements, group feelings, sensationalism, dramatic sense, creative genius as a mouthpiece of the race. And that's a rather good summary of what was understood about, from a traditional perspective, of the sign of Aquarius. Now let us look next. What we're going to share here are some of the key words and some of the ways in which the Aquarius sign archetype is expressed in the Shamanic Astrology Handbook. And we place it in certain categories. It's the same categories that the original zodiac archetype creation of the Hellenistic culture, categorized and systematized by Ptolemy in the 2nd century, how it looked at the signs. And you can see all the key words here: non-personal, detached, brilliant, innovative, needs lots of space, visionary, eccentric, idiosyncratic, avant-garde, higher truth. You can just go through all of these key words, and that's pretty much how we have taught the Aquarian sign over the years. I like the question, what is the nature of expanded states of consciousness and freedom? And so it has to do with expansion, it has to do with freedom, it has to do with being different than normal. I put a lot of emphasis on that kind of thing. In a few moments, we can talk about the implication of the two waves of the sign of Aquarius, and then we can relate that to the two waves of the constellation of Aquarius. But it's clearly, as first defined by the Hellenistic culture, systematized by Ptolemy, it is seen as an air sign, and it is placed in the category of archetypal masculine or positive, and those are the old words that would be used for that, positive, masculine. And also in our system, we put it into, we use the expression self-interest, or how do we put it, self-exploration, like all of what are generally called the fixed signs. So then we can go to the next one, which is another way we've understood this. This is from our divination card deck. And this summarizes it, how it is we've seen the sign. Explores the widest possibilities of the expansion of consciousness for its own sake and as an end in itself. Aquarius is dedicated to unlimited freedom and unbounded spaciousness. In the human realm, it's always resonant with innovation, uniqueness, eccentricity, and the avant-garde. Aquarius has little interest in consensus realities or ordinary conventions. At its best, it aspires to see what others can't see, and then to be established in the place of the ultimate witness, the eye behind the eye, ultimate objectivity. And then we have a lot of other key words there about how we see it in the school: air, archetypal masculine, evolutionary, not involutionary. We make a distinction between the signs in the mystery schools that are going like up, and then the ones that are spirit coming into matter, the involutionary ones like earth and water. Non-relational, impersonal, spacious, free, and then we have some of the historical themes and stories. And the spiritual path to courageously keep expanding the vision of possibilities, come up with innovations, to see the ways that others do not see, to always question conformity to the herd and tyranny of consensus reality. Now, keep that last part in mind as we go through this, because there's confusion, in my view, about that statement. Okay, let's go to the next one. Back in the early 90s, I was very inspired by quite an avant-garde philosopher. He put out a journal called The Leading Edge. And he was, by the way, I knew his chart. So he was a triple Aquarian, Moon, Sun, Aquarius rising. And this is how he explained his purpose. And this is what I have resonated with the most about the sign of Aquarius. All life forms should have the right and the opportunity to have an existence which is endowed with the freedom to produce the maximum amount of probable lines of reality in an evolving direction by choice, without repression of awareness or manipulation of physical, mental, or spiritual aspects. Now, you can certainly see, as I'm reading it, and as you read it yourself, if you're watching the video of this, that is certainly written by an air sign person, is it not? I mean, there's a fairly strong intellect in play when you look at that. And certainly that is reflective, I think, of the highest ideals of the Aquarius sign. But there has been this confusion about it even before we came into 2020 and the global dilemmas that have happened since early 2020. There were astrologers back in 2019 that would say, well, astrology, that Aquarius is about bottom up. So it has, and that was like tuning into the freedom aspect of Aquarius. But there's also an element of Aquarius that is top down. And I think this is actually reflective of the dual rulership of Aquarius. That until Uranus was discovered in the late 1700s, Aquarius only was ruled by Saturn, using the older understanding of rulership. In fact, Saturn was the quote ruler of both Capricorn and Aquarius. And I get the conversation also is, well, what do we mean by Saturn? Is it the Saturn of the last 2,000 years, or is it the Saturn of 300,000 years? And unfortunately, so-called traditional astrology of the last 2,000 years has bought into the more recent version of Saturn, which is patriarchal, father, control, judgment, shame, guilt, and so on, which is not really part of the much larger understanding of Saturn. I mean, Saturn, after all, even in the Kabbalah, is on the female side of the tree of life. I think there's a far richer and deeper sort of matriarchal or feminine version of Saturn. After all, it was a symbol, even when you go back to the early Greek writers, it was a symbol of the Golden Age. I mean, it's certainly not the way we would think of, for the most part, of Saturn today. So we have to be careful about how we envision what we mean by Saturn. I personally think Saturn is simply an operating manual. It's like these the rules of engagement here, being in third density life. It also, for human beings, it's like a maturation guideline. What are the phases of life? When does maturation happen? When are the different phases of the timeline of our life happen? It need not have the implications of the superego, the judge, the critic, the shame, the guilt, the deficiency, the judgment, and all the rest of that. That, in my view, that's an infection that's come into it. But I'm just trying to give you a sense of the way the sign has been perceived, but then also a certain confusion about it. I know that in my own case, and I'll just bring this in right now. I was, as someone who went through the late 60s and having been involved in that whole thing of the glamour of the beginning of the age of Aquarius, at that time period, the emphasis was very much on uniqueness and individuality. Be your archetype. It was certainly a rejection of the conformity to the mass, a rejection of the consensus reality that was so oppressive at that particular time. So it was definitely a sign of freedom, and harmony and truth and understanding and peace and all the rest of that. However, by 1970, 71, I just want to illustrate a book that's, if you can ever find it, it's really good. It's called The Age of Aquarius. It was written in 1970. The subtitle was Technology and the Cultural Revolution. And the back of the book says, The Age of Aquarius or Armageddon. And essentially, the book, and it's by an excellent writer called William Braden. He's no longer with us now. He is much of the book is interviews with some of the leading thinkers of the time, and he perceived there would be two possibilities. One would be what was so current at that time period, which he summarized through the word matriarchal humanism. So that was one possibility for Aquarius, matriarchal humanism. Then he saw the other probable line of reality was technocratic scientific control programs. And he was suggesting it could go either direction. It was clear, he certainly was more on the side of matriarchal humanism, as so many of us in the early 70s were. So this all has to do, so what is the actual nature of Aquarius? And are we just like putting too much Leo into it? Or is there something about Aquarius that truly is about the freedom of our uniqueness and of our even our eccentricity, and to not want to merge with the group hive mind or the mob? I mean, pretty much every Aquarian type of revolution ended up being the energy of the mob. It becomes like the revolution eats its own children, that kind of thing. So there is that dark side of Aquarius. Let's go to the next slide here. Now, we're going to now shift our attention to the constellation, which is water. And I'd like to take you on a little bit of a journey here. By the way, this slide is of an early Greek figure who was identified with Aquarius. This is actually before the Ganymede cupbearer story came in that had a completely different cultural purpose. So it turns out that in virtually every, I'm just going to share some stuff with you here that came from the research I was doing. A lot of this is actually found in that excellent resource that actually came out in the latter part of the 1800s. I had it here somewhere. Star Names, Their Lore and Meaning, a great resource. So the constellation of Aquarius pours into the fish, sometimes the river Eridanus. It was the fountains of the Nile. It was water buckets. It was by a man or a boy pouring water from a bucket or urn. It was actually in the early Christian tradition associated with John the Baptist. Obviously. The constellation of the Water-Bearer is found in an area of this all water. Capricornus, Cetus, Delphinus, Eridanus, Hydra, Pisces, Pisces Australis. This was known as the quote unquote the sea, which was under the control of Aquarius. Now, the Egyptians, who borrowed the imagery, they related Aquarius to the constellation, to the rising of the Nile. They would perceive the river god identified with Aquarius as sinking his huge urn into the river to fill it. In China, interestingly, it was the symbol of the emperor Tuochuan, who during the reign was a great deluge. And then later that became a constellation of a precious vase. So we have, and actually the constellation itself, actually we'll come back to Deucalion. Let's go to the next slide. So in the ancient Babylonian and Sumerian tablets, there was this figure, the constellation Gula, that was known as the Great One, and it was always identified with the Babylonians, Ea, the god Ea, and the Sumerians, it was Enki. And this goes way back, I mean, kind of in the same time period as where they had Capricorn, which was also seen in many of the renditions. You know, we see it now as a goatfish, but originally it was the image of a boat that had that was on the water. So this was also the portion of Iraq, that area of Samaria and Babylonia, where they saw that this is associated with the sea to the south. And interestingly, would go into the underworld by a series of waterways down to the sea. So we have the Great One, Enki, Ea, and there's so many stories about this, but he was the one of the Anunnaki that is the one who loved humanity and saved humanity after his brother wanted to destroy humanity. So there's a lot of, he was like the god of some of the attributions to Enki, Ea, Gula, the Great One. He was associated with the water of purification. He was the god representing civilization, wisdom, and culture. He was the creator and protector of mankind and the world in general. Now, in doing this research, I also found that the same name, Gula, was given to a goddess. Gula, the healing goddess. And there were major cults associated with her. I mean, if you do an internet search on this, you'll actually find current organizations that call themselves Gula, associated with healing communities. Now, what I love about this is that it's been the contention of our school and this paradigm that every sign and every planet, and we could say that in a sense every constellation, has both a masculine and a feminine side. Those that have a more matriarchal bent like to actually draw the water-bearer as a woman. Well, here we know that even back in Sumeria, that there was the healing goddess Gula, the great one, as well as it was identified with Enki and Ea and the god, the bearer of culture, you know, civilization, wisdom, and culture. I'm just sharing all of this with you, you know, also opening the doors for more research on this. But the point is that the constellation is water, and all the imagery is pouring water. In fact, Jung, the last book he ever wrote was called the Aeon, and a good portion of that had to try to decipher what the imagery of pouring the water that's poured into the mouth of the fish. Other stories had the water being poured into the river Eridanus, but it was all about water and healing. Now this brings us to Deucalion. If we can go back to just that image. In the early Greek stories, we have this figure known as Deucalion, who interestingly was the son of Prometheus. Prometheus, well known as connected to Uranus, actually, and as the god, you know, the demigod who stole fire from the gods. But he also had children, and he was a healer, and you know, there's many things that about Prometheus. We won't go into all of his story here, but he had a son known as Deucalion, and there was a flood, and it was Deucalion. It's almost like a latter version of the Noah story. Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha ended up being the ones that survived. And in many of the stories, after saving humanity from the flood or of the deluge, they repopulated the world. And the imagery is that they would pick up stones, and part of their repopulation is they would throw the stone over their back and it would become a person. That's the whole story on that. This was a story that very much predated the story that you usually read when you look at the mythology of Aquarius, where they talk about the cupbearer and Zeus and Ganymede, and in my opinion, that story distorts very much what the original essence of the water constellation was. And just as we'll see here in the next few moments, each culture can project a story that is based upon the cultural needs of the time. So the Ganymede story, the cupbearer story, the Zeus story with that was actually a story that was to legitimatize, to make legitimate what was very common in the elite circles of Greece, which was the men would have their first relationship with young boys. So it's a very, very different issue than what the original storylines of the constellation was. So I think that what's important to know about this is that even in the story of what is the age of Aquarius, it's the movement into a constellation and has very little, I will not say nothing, to do with the sign itself. Because obviously when the Greeks invented the seasonal zodiac, the directional zodiac, the 12 by 30 zodiac archetype, they created something that stood separately from where the constellations are. So here, this brings up a very fascinating issue. The reason that they developed the sign-based zodiac, which was based upon solstices and equinoxes, was because the stories that had been projected onto the constellations didn't work anymore because of the fact the constellations showed up in different seasons. So they have to have a different frame of reference. So that if you based the rising of the Nile based upon the setting of Aquarius, but then after a period of time, that's not what was happening at the flooding of the Nile. The way that the water constellation had certain stories projected on it was based upon the reality 2, 3, 4,000 BC. But that was no longer happening in around 500 BC. So they had to come up with a new frame of reference. It's understandable that some of the imagery of the constellation would be found in how they perceived the sign. But they knew there was a difference between the sign and the constellation. It all got very confused. And so that now when we talk about the sign of Aquarius, we forget that the constellation had originally inspired it. All right, so this is really an important issue because there's a maximum difference between the essence of water and air. And to create a sign with the same name and to make it an air sign, intellectual sign, a left brain sign, is making us forget, helps us to forget that, oh my gosh, this is all based upon an area of the sky that's water. So the age of Aquarius is really about the redemption, it's what Jung wrote about, that the waters of life, of spirit. I mean, if we look at it not just as physical water, but we would look at it as that kind of love, ananda love, that I've quoted this before. It's like I opened my heart to the whole universe and found it was loving. There's a feeling of connection to the heart and soul of the one reality, and that's the gift of Aquarius. Now, the next thing that needs to be mentioned here is the dual rulership. So, I mean, again, as I was mentioning earlier, that up until the time Uranus was discovered, it was Saturn's the rulership. And I've always had this feeling, if we look at the symbol of Aquarius, and I just wanted to show you something. Here's an original imagery of Enki, Ea, and you can see the glyph. And you'll notice here, the glyph, the end of the glyph goes down. But maybe this is reversed. No, it actually goes up, so it's reversed. But there has been this goes way back. In fact, some of the historical research shows that glyph goes back as far as 30,000 years. So that's been around for a very long time, and it's a very ancient constellational symbol. In more recent times, whenever I teach Aquarius, I say one wave represents the uniqueness, the eccentricity, the avant-garde, the being different than consensus reality, the leading edge aspect of Aquarius, and the other wave would represent the spiritual path, objective awareness, the eye behind the eye, spaciousness, the unbounded consciousness, right? So those are the two ways I always looked at it. But in reconsidering this, and this is why I'm talking about this now, influenced by Saturn's relationship with Venus and Mars, is that I believe that the waves also, you can imagine these two pathways. Matriarchal humanism, which would have much more to do with the influence of the water aspect of it, but then also the technocratic aspect of it. And those we could thought of as the two waves. Then that's more Uranian. I also think that if you can actually write that glyph in a number of different ways, you could actually have the end of the glyph go up or the end of the glyph go down. I might want to suggest that when it goes down, that would actually be the Saturn rulership. If it goes up, that would be the Uranian rulership. So you've got the two different sides of Aquarius. This does not answer the question, however, about what is more dominant about the sign. Is it supposed to be about uniqueness, freedom, and individuality, or is it the surrender to the collectivity? And actually, Rajar suggests that, of course, it does have that collective essence. So it's different than Leo in that sense. So how does this all then relate to the Venus and Mars saga? Well, I want to go more deeply into what I was suggesting a few moments ago, that when we project stories onto planetary or stellar alignments, it serves many functions. One is that stories are very useful, but still the story can serve an agenda. The story can promote the mindset of a given time period. So, for example, back to Venus and Mars, one of the stories that was projected onto this portion of the Venus and Mars relationship, that is to say, when it is within 10 degrees for a long period of time in the morning sky, and that pattern happens about every 6.5 years, that was the relationship of Venus and Mars that inspired the ancient troubadour story and fairy tale story of Rapunzel. And the whole story goes through many, many different phases, but it's when they would reunite after being in the wilderness, after Mars goes into the underworld, after Venus is all off by herself, they reunite in the morning sky. And according to that telling of the story, that is when they would live happily ever after. So the union of Venus and Mars was a kind of a celebration. And interestingly, even in my own practice, I've had a number of clients that just intuitively decided to get married during this Venus-Mars conjunction. But that story of the prince and Rapunzel was actually a situation that was to change how that culture at that time understood male-female relationships. If you go back to Sumeria, then there was the Dumuzi version of it. And that is when Inanna comes out of the underworld and sees her consort Dumuzi sitting on her throne and says, "You're next, buddy. You got to go to the underworld next." So that was a whole different thing. That had more to do with the cultural traditions of that time, which was a shift from matriarchy to patriarchy at that time. What story do we want to project onto it now? Because now it's the part of the story where Venus and Mars are together, and which ancient people projected stories onto. Now, whether the majority of the world now are storytellers, still the primary tool used by media, by our current versions of storytelling, is a narrative. What narrative do we project onto this? And what would Saturn and Aquarius do to Venus and Mars? What would be that version of "and they lived happily ever after"? Well, this is where it gets back into the shadow of Aquarius, where a technological elite, top down, using technology, kind of Atlantis on steroids, will say, we have a view about how everybody can be happy, like you will own nothing and you will be happy. You will have no privacy and it will be fine. This is like the narrative that is being presented. And that includes this whole thing that's happening where biological identity is being attempted to have it be eliminated. The Supreme Court person that's up for being on the Supreme Court could not define what a woman was, all right? And so essentially we now have 72 genders. You know, we have like an unlimited number of possibilities. That's a good thing, but it's being removed from our biological identity. This all blends into transhumanism, virtual identity, having an avatar, living in a virtual world, and takes us further and further away from our biological identity. Now, I certainly think that the constellation of Aquarius has very much to do. I mean, it was basically a savior of humanity, cared about human beings. Enki thought humans were great. He wanted to not destroy them. And Deucalion, the same. He was one of the ones who rescued and repopulated the earth after arrogance and hubris had taken over the earth. So my point here is we have to be very careful that Venus and Mars coming together at this time period, and they lived happily ever after, there is no longer any biological identity. And so therefore you can be anything you want to be virtually. And so that the transhumanism movement is the ultimate attempt of the shadow of Aquarius to collectivize the entire Earth under the guise of harmony and understanding and sustainability and all these kinds of things, but in the hands of a technocratic elite. And I personally think that is adverse to the at least the version of Aquarius that was the age of Aquarius idea at the end of the 60s, early 70s, which is a matriarchal humanism, not technocratic, scientific, technological control. So I think
it's interesting how the sort of reasoning for both of those approaches, though, does seem to be in an effort to gain more freedom.
Right. Yeah, I know. That's the thing that's so tricky about it. I mean, they both of these different pathways would say, you know, we really care. We want to make it work for everybody. You know, don't you want to have all your needs met? You know, don't you want to be anything you want to be? You know, and you can now be whatever avatar you want to be. You know, you can go to a business meeting and you can be Genghis Khan if you want. You know, you can have sex virtually. You know, and total freedom. You know, in the metaverse, right? And you don't even have to. It's so interesting watching how this whole thing is developed, because in the early 70s, those of us that were kind of I think we were the leading edge astrologers at that point, were definitely attacking consensus reality. So the gender roles for men, the gender roles for women needed to be broken apart. You know, so basically bringing masculine and feminine into all the planets and all the signs, bringing the goddesses in, having far more different possibilities for a man or a woman. That we were totally, wow, that was a fantastic Renaissance moment, you know, for the culture. However, that's not the same as the elimination of biological identity. For those who wish to see the deeper reasoning behind what I'm sharing now, I do suggest the seminars, vlogcasts that I've done on sex and gender to get a view of this, because I think even the word gender has been hijacked, just as the word Aquarius has been hijacked, Saturn has been hijacked. I mean, we have to go back into the roots of these things to actually see what the essence is. Up until about early 1970, gender was never used interchangeably with sex. You were XX human or an XY human, and then our view was you could be any expression of that you want, but you had a biological identity. And now it's actually, you can't even say, it's not even on a list, you're whether a man or a woman. It's no, I'm a, you know, 72 different possibilities. Now, I think that, like in our school, in our paradigm, the card deck reflects it. We actually, I'm not trying to say this is the ultimate number, but at least within the sacred geometry of our paradigm, there are 24 genders, but you start out as XX or XY. Unfortunately, there's a great deal of confusion around this issue, and it goes actually all the way back to the origin of the human species. Even the sign Gemini has been hijacked. The original imagery was a man and a woman coming out of primordial creation. The story then changed, to fit the agenda of a particular time. So I think a deeper dive into the origin of the words we use, and to not just necessarily go along with the hijack of a word like Saturn, or as I'm suggesting, Aquarius. I mean, the confusion was there in the late 60s. We were talking about the imagery of the age of Aquarius that was actually much more about the freedom element and the human element of the constellation, and the loving and caring and compassionate side of it. We didn't realize at that point that there was a difference between them. I mean, that information came later. But now still people will talk about the age of Aquarius and using distorted images of the sign, and not even being aware that it's really the constellation and not the sign when we talk about a new age of Aquarius. But these are the larger issues at stake here, but I'm bringing it back to this time period we're in right now, which is also, of course, the larger story, the Pluto return of the United States, the upcoming Chiron return, the Neptune opposition, square Mars and Gemini, a lot of stuff with the US chart, the fourth turning, which is said to be coming to a conclusion at 2024, 2025. And then we have this major punctuation point as revealed by the way Venus and Mars are in this larger saga of the dance of Venus and Mars. For those that are familiar with that saga information, the larger story of the Venus cycle now, and it just started when Venus rose as a morning star, is emphasizing the sign of Capricorn. So the over story of the sacred feminine is Capricorn, while the over story of Mars, the 26-month cycle, is Aries. And so therefore that's the larger dance between Aries and Capricorn. But here now, in this rather rare and beautiful and evocative connection of Saturn and Venus and Mars in the morning sky, in the Dumuzi, in the Rapunzel phase, what story do we want to project onto it? The elimination of biological procreation, biological sexuality. Do we want to go to the unlimited possibilities in the metaverse with no biology being important? Or do we want to have it really be your archetype? You can be anything you want to be, but you are a physical, organic human being. I mean, after all, Aquarius was not originally about technology. It had to do with redemption. It had to do with healing. I mean, the goddess of Aquarius was the healing goddess. The god of the water-bearer, Enki, was the savior of humanity. So there is that larger humanitarian and element of it, making it work for as many people as possible.
I think it's really important that you're bringing up the fact that the Venus and Mars saga is tied into this right now, because, and to think that we're talking about overstories of Capricorn and Aries, which are both householder signs, which are kind of the most human breakdown of the signs that we have, right, which are all about life in the human world, whether it's Aries protecting it or Capricorn maintaining it for future generations. So I think that answers a little bit of the question for me, that this Aquarian element of that cycle has to be guiding these characters to do better householding, better culture bearing.
Great point. And so, unlike some of the more recent ones, which were not in the householder, culture bear, overstory archetypes, that's what this is about. You know, how do we want the world to be? What do we actually want to protect? Do we not want to protect the earth, protect her animals, protect her plants, protect her children? I mean, that's an Aries function. And then Capricorn, at its best, is setting up systems, organizations, ways of being that work, you know, like the concern for the 7 generations to follow. And so there was a new level engagement. And so I'm hoping that it's the more matriarchally humanist version of Aquarius, rather than the technocratic scientific elite that think they know what's better for everybody else. It actually brings up the issue, you know, using the word democracy. They sometimes say that it's sometimes said that Aquarius is the sign of democracy. I can remember, this is way back after the Tiananmen massacre. I was giving a talk in Vancouver, and the Chinese overseas students put up a statue, and they called it the goddess of democracy. And it was a statue of Kuan Yin, interestingly. So I mean, so that was their reaction against the Chinese Communist Party's control program. You know, so they were overseas, and you know, it's the goddess of democracy. But the problem with democracy is that if people are not, they think they're free, but they only have to say 2 choices, or that they are manipulated into a vote, or that someone can win an election by majority, for example. That is not what the original US vision was. That was a republic, not a democracy. It's too easy in these times to have a democracy turn into mob rule, you know, and that's also the shadow of Aquarius. I wanted to just maybe finish this speculative investigation with 2 things. One is that I wanted to share some significant things about 3 of the main architects of the technocratic hive state that's coming up. We can look at, first of all, the chart of Jeff Bezos. And the reason I wanted to show this one is because I wanted you to see Venus, Saturn conjunct 21 Aquarius, 24 Aquarius. That's very much related to our current situation here. But then his counterpart, his competition, is of course Elon, the cool psychopath, right? And so he is also, look at this, Mars 20 Aquarius, the North Node 15 Aquarius. What's very interesting about, there's so many things interesting about this chart, but I'm wanting to bring up this alignment between his chart. You know, he's the one who wants to put a chip into people and connect them to the quantum computer. And Bezos and Musk kind of battle it out, you know, who's the richest person on the planet. And they both really have that idea of everything into the hive mind. Although Musk, you know, well, he must be the cool one. He smokes marijuana on the Joe Rogan show, you know. I mean, but he has the eccentric girlfriend. But oh my goodness, I mean, he's been put in a place to be running the space program and the electric vehicles and all of that. That's a whole other story. I've done different dives into this in some previous presentations about technocracy. I mean, he comes from the lineage of Canadian technocrats, technocratic party back in the mid-30s. And then the last one I want to show you is actually the Ray Kurzweil. He is the one in Silicon Valley who kind of is the patron saint of the Silicon Valley transhumanist cult. He's the one who first came up with the idea of the singularity, that would be the point when biological humans will merge into AI. And I think he said it was 2030, but I think they've kind of sped up the timetable. They've been trying to. And look at here, look what he's got. Look at the sun, 23 Aquarius. And you can explore this a lot. He's also just like Klaus Schwab. I mean, both are these Pisces moons, you know, with that Jupiter going over their Pisces moon. And you know, and they probably believe that you know, they're doing good for humanity, you know. But I think it's part of the. It's like these Atlanteans back to see if they can get it right this time, you know. After what happened at you know, halfway back in the precessional cycle. With the cometary strike and the younger Dryas and the freeze up and the raising of the ocean and everything. So the last thing I want to share is that you can, you don't have to believe this. This is, you know, this is just to inspire your imagination. I'm sure some people listening to this will be, oh yeah, great. I'm glad we were talking about this. Others would say, no, it's not possible. It's just conspiracy theory, right? Or it's just designed to build some, you know, expand some minds here. And but this is strictly from an astrological perspective, based on the history about the sign and the constellation, and using the old stories, and knowing that we are in a position where we have the freedom. Hopefully, we'll have the freedom to project what story we want onto this. I know what story I want to project onto it. So I'm going to just suggest that each and every one of you, in the spirit of shamanic astrology, go out while these planets are still so prominent in the morning sky, tune in and get your own transmission. What are they telling you? And you know, it's helpful to know something about what they symbolize, but to put that aside and just, you know, kind of let the transmission come through. You know, what is the story that's being told? What does it actually mean? And they lived happily ever after. Where do you want to live happily ever after? Prime Earth or the metaverse? Any final comments from your side, Awen? I know this was something that you didn't have that much you know, background on it, but I really want to thank you for your support in putting this together.
I'll just also encourage everybody. I've been out watching, and it's been a pretty stunning show in the morning sky. Like you said, the perfect right triangles, changing configuration every day. It's really pretty cool sight.
A couple of days ago here at this latitude, that we even saw them configured in the perfect 13, 12, 5 triangle, which is the specific triangle that is the silver fraction that shows the magical relationship between the cycle of the sun and the moon, which I did a further adventures of shamanic astrology webinar with Gemini Brett about that. But yeah, to be with it, you know, to form your relationship with the stars and the planets and the constellations is what we suggest here. So I'll do another one of these next month. I have no idea what the topic will be. The next thing we have coming up on our schedule is, for the school schedule, is the mentoring, the group mentoring. And that's next week, I think, yeah.
Well, and we've got new moon coming up, and we always do our new moon monthly members call for members. So that's
I'll be on that one too. That'll be one that I get to be on. I don't do them every month, but I'll do it together with our president, Mary.
Yeah, and that's where we get to hear all the alignments and astrological insights for the whole month from a shamanic astrology perspective. So it's really an awesome perk for people who are members. You can find out more about that on our website, shamanicastrology.com. And we'll have the recording of this video as well as a transcript of the talk, as along with all the other vlogcasts Daniel's done. So thank you for sharing.
I just thought of something, because thinking about what, as we go into next month, because we'll be entering into the eclipse season, but on the next new moon, it's also the time period of the Jupiter is rising in the morning sky, and there'll be a beautiful conjunction of Venus and Jupiter at that time. So that's the next dazzling show in the morning sky, will be the Jupiter Venus conjunction. So stay tuned for more about that. Thank you, Awen, and let's see you all again soon. Bye.